Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled to have you here for this first regional webinar series of 2021. And it's going to be a rich discussion today. We're looking forward to hearing from Dr. Michael Marks, but also for your input and perspective that you bring as coaches. And these regional webinars are really a great way to connect with colleagues all across the region. We have people here from 16 chapters across the region, all the way from Texas to North Carolina, even the Caribbean. So we're looking forward to the 10 different sessions that we'll be able to enjoy throughout 2021. And this really gives us an opportunity to hear from industry leaders and thought experts and have collaboration that we don't have access to in our local chapters. So thank you for spending this afternoon with us and contributing to the discussion, but also investing in your professional development as coaches. These trainings continue to equip us, as well as providing the ongoing CCEUs for credentialing. And I am very happy to welcome you on behalf of ICF San Antonio. My name is Carissa Gay, and we are really looking forward to our conversation here this afternoon. And our speaker here is Dr. Michael Marks, and he has a rich background in the coaching industry, has served in many different capacities, from the Ethics Review Board to the Community of Practice to writing and leading different initiatives. So we're in for a real treat with our conversation today. Just a few housekeeping things so you can get the most out of our conversation. Just to orient you to Zoom, we're in the webinar format here today. So if you go up to the top of your panel, you can see the different features there to be able to adjust your sound settings or even come on or off video. When we open up later for Q&A, you might have the opportunity to be able to share with us. So just be familiar with those settings as well. We want this to be an interactive conversation. Dr. Marks will present for the first half of the session, and then we'll open it up for questions. So please put your thoughts and questions into the chat box, and we'll be monitoring the Q&A to pull out the questions that are going to be most beneficial for us to talk about as a group here. And you'll notice there is both the chat and the Q&A. So if you can put your questions in the Q&A box, that would be fantastic. As we open this session, we want the content to be as valuable as possible for you. And certainly the topic of supporting clients or people that come to us bringing up the topic of suicide is so relevant right now. But we'd love to hear from you. What do you want to learn from the presentation today? If you could go ahead and put that in the chat box, that would be fantastic. What would equip you as a coach to effectively serve your clients and to just be a resource in the community? We have Nicholas, insight and awareness is what he's looking for. I know for me as a coach, just how do I approach those conversations in the most beneficial way possible? How do we report as needed? Being able to identify triggers, awareness and tools, resources to share, when to punt a client onto a therapist or clinician, scripts of what to say, signs and symptoms. These are all really practical things, and Dr. Marks has a wealth of both information as well as even best practices to share with us as we go into these conversations. How to really hear what's being said. That's really excellent, Sally. How to sense if a client is at risk for suicide, even if he or she is not mentioning those thoughts. That really is important for us in the work that we do. What not to say. Yes, we all want to know that. We don't want to cause more risk in the situation. How to build a referral pipeline. Yes, that's important that we have resources on the bench that we can direct people to and know that it's going to be a quality source. Well, thank you all for sharing your input. We're looking forward to a very rich conversation here in the little under an hour that we have with Dr. Marks. So just to make sure that there's no lingering questions in your mind before we jump in, you will get access to the slides after the presentation, so you don't have to copiously jot down every fact that's on them. Those will be sent to you. And if you are here attending this webinar live, you've registered with the link, you will be sent the CCEU for that as well. Just give it at least a week of turnaround time to have that be sent out to you. It is really a privilege to have Dr. Michael Marks with us today. He serves on the Independent Review Board for ICF. He and his team have founded a nonprofit specifically on coaching suicide awareness. So there's a lot of expertise and certainly passion there. When he and I were preparing for today's conversation, he said he's shared this information, close to 200 times. So this is something he really believes in and wants to equip coaches in. So I want to give him as much time as possible for this conversation. So as you're listening, please put any questions that you have into that Q&A box, and we'll be reviewing those and allowing time at the end so that we can hear firsthand from you what you've experienced and make sure that you're walking away with the tools that you want in this area. So with that, I will go ahead and stop this PowerPoint and turn things over to our guest, Dr. Michael Marks. Oh, and it looks like you're on mute, Dr. Marks.
That happens. Thank you, Carissa. It is absolutely my pleasure to be here. As mentioned, this is really close to my heart. I don't even know why. At 17, I was the community of practice leader for ethics for, the global community. And it occurred to me that we tell the coach, if the client says suicide, you have to do something, but we've never told them what to do. So in April, we put together a community of practice meeting on that. And since then, we have been basically repeating the same thing to anyone that will listen. So what I want you to do is take good notes, but also this PowerPoint is totally available to you, as I've worked out with Anik and Carissa, and please use it, repeat it. I'll give you an example of a person in Ireland in 2016 saw this presentation. In July, he was talking to a client in California whose sister was visiting her and was talking suicide. And she called the coach in Ireland. He didn't know what to do. And so he referred to this PowerPoint presentation, pulled it up, called the client back in California, and everything ended well. So, that's how things work. I'm going to give you a lot of resources, particularly at the end, where, you can call the official and very well-trained mental health professionals who will take over, from where you leave off. But in the end, it comes down to listening. It comes down to, really caring that the person gets what they need at that moment. And that's what coaches do well. We listen very well. We ask powerful questions. And I'm going to give you a lot of those powerful questions. You don't want to ask the wrong ones. But there aren't very many of them, the wrong ones. And it's basically just staying in tune with the client. And then, as you've requested in the chat here, how do I refer? So this is known as QPR, question, persuade, refer. And you'll hear me allude to that several times. It's an organization founded by Paul Quinnett and the QPR Institute. You can get a very good overview training for $29.95. I'm making a commercial for the QPRinstitute.org, and take their online training and have a certifiable overview and what to do in a suicide situation. So I'm going to give you our best shot. When I say our, as was mentioned, we've started a nonprofit for coaching suicide awareness. Love to have you on our team. We meet twice a month, and we talk about how to handle suicide and launch our nonprofit. And it's going really, really well. So enough of preliminaries. Let's start sharing screen here. Okay. That one. Okay. Carissa, you can give me a thumbs up or a yes that the share screen's coming over well.
It looks great.
Okay, good. So here is a map until 2014 of the 30% increase in the United States. And you look at Nevada has a 1% decrease. You say, way to go, Nevada. Well, until 2099, they had the highest in the nation, and they got their act together with, awareness programs, kind of like what we're doing right here. And it actually decreased. So what has happened since 2014? In 2019, according to the CDC, suicide in the United States actually decreased. In 2020, we don't know the numbers, but we know in Maryland it has decreased. It is anticipated that, of course, around the nation it will, increase. So it's always kind of an interesting question to answer. What's going on? What are the trends? What are the endangered groups? The answer is we don't know. You can basically single out any particular group and say it's higher on one side and lower on the other. In other words, male suicide attempters complete. That's the politically correct language. We don't prefer the word, commit suicide, because that has that sin stigma connotation here. So we attempt and complete. Male attempters complete 5 times more in the United States than female attempters, because they use more violent means. They use, guns, strangulation, and car accidents. Women prefers the wrong word. Use carbon monoxide poisoning, car in the garage, and particularly medications. Around the world, the the means of doing suicide is different. For example, in agricultural countries in Africa, they take agricultural poisoning. So all that is just kind of a cultural type of thing. You be aware of what kind of cultural setting that person's in, because that could affect the way they're approaching their attempt. Okay, so let's go through some scenarios here. Your friend Sally calls you on Sunday. Her sister Valerie has just visited in the afternoon and discussed suicide. Sally does not believe there's any immediate danger. What should she do? We want you to, be able to say, okay, I don't remember all the details, but I remember this. I have to distinguish between, is it critical or is it non-critical? In other words, is there a high likelihood of the person completing the attempt or not? That's really the first step. And then after that, as I said, it's basically listening and asking the right questions. So just to spark your mind as to what are the potentials for, when you need to be aware. Frank mentions in a conversation that his wife, in a coaching conversation, has talked several times about taking her life. He's scared and angry. How could she think about hurting him and their children like this? So, real case scenario, Frank didn't believe that his wife would actually take her life. To my knowledge, she never has. although I haven't talked to this client in almost 3 years, but he was angry and he was concerned about his kids. And that was the point of the coaching conversation. How do I deal with the fact that my wife keeps talking about suicide? Um, Coaching is a trusted relationship. And, a lot of times people will look at their coach as a higher trust person to confide in than they would any immediate mental health professional. And so when we talk about referring someone to a mental health professional, that is obviously the right step to go. But we also want to keep in mind that in this journey, until the person is completely, I want to use the word healed, but I'll just go with over it, until the person is over the suicidal ideation, you can be a significant part of that journey. For those of us that work in the corporate environment, um, your company has several staff members who have taken leave of absence due to mental duress. Talk about, 2020, and they have asked for time off because of their fear of suicide. What can you do to help your employees? So what we're wanting to do in this particular webinar is increase your awareness to the point where you have an idea where to start. Where to finish is a long journey. I've been working with many companies on plans for such things over many years. It's a long-tailed environment, and it takes a lot of cooperation from everybody. But the important thing is that it's on the table, and it's okay. It's okay to uh, work on the topic of suicide. It's not verboten. It's not a bad thing to talk about. As we will discuss here in a couple of minutes, it's quite the opposite. The more we talk about it, the easier it is for people to deal with it. Okay, some of you were asking for signs and symptoms. I prefer to call them invitations or balloons. There's a training that I've taken called the ASSIST training, ASIST. It's often offered by your local hospital. It's actually very expensive, but there's a lot of government money floating around, wanting everyone who will take this program to get free access to it. And they call it balloons because people send up invitations, consciously or usually subconsciously, about what are the signs. I also like to call them red flags. So someone asks in a coaching conversation, what am I listen for? Okay, let's go through the list. Talking about wanting to die or to kill themselves, looking for a way to kill themselves, searching online, buying a gun, looking for means, feeling hopeless, no reason to live. The client might say, I'm just completely hopeless. I'm useless. I'm no good to anyone. Well, in and of itself, that doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot, but when it's consistent and when it's serious, you might take that as a warning sign. Feeling trapped with unbearable pain. One emergency room nurse said, I like the question, are you wanting to end your life or are you wanting to stop the pain? And the answer is, of course, always, about the pain and not the life. We humans obviously have this innate desire to continue life and to see that life is continued. That's why you're on this webinar today. And I applaud you for that here. And I applaud the ICF chapters involved. I've talked to a lot of chapter leaders across the world, given this presentation to many of them, but I've also gotten the reaction, oh, our chapter doesn't need to worry about that. That's not going to be a problem here. Well, good, until it is. And then we have a problem. Talking about being a burden to others. This is a very typical one here. I really don't want my family to go out of their way, and, I'm useless. Everyone else has to take care of me. An increase of alcohol or drugs in a majority of suicide attempts, alcohol and or drugs are present. In other words, they're numbing their emotional state at the time, and come to an irrational conclusion that the only way out is to end their lives. which is, um, not helped at all by the inebriation caused by alcohol and drugs. In an intervention, if the person is totally drunk, we basically have to wait until they're sober before we can actually start talking to them. So, when there is a serious inebriation going on here, often just keeping that person, for lack of a better word, locked down is the best choice until they're sober. Acting anxiously or agitated, behaving recklessly, buying things, selling things, being very jumpy. In and of itself, that's fairly benign, but, combined with some of these other things, you might wonder to yourself, is this person thinking about taking their life? Sleeping too little, sleeping too much, withdrawing or isolating themselves. It doesn't usually happen that they start, suddenly becoming a social butterfly and being very extroverted in their interactions. Quite the opposite. They tend to withdraw, showing rage, talking about seeking revenge, extreme mood swings. Okay. So, what we're saying here is combined, these things might light up to you and make the situation, alarming. But really, the first thing that we need to do is decide whether the situation is critical. Among interventionists, we talk about 4 levels: critical, high, moderate, and low. And I want to introduce, some of um, the 3 things that would clearly identify that a person is in a critical. You've also noticed in these slides, I've given the national, hotline number, um, 1-800-273-TALK, and this one is showing the Spanish number. You might jot those down in your notes and keep them handy. So the first thing is that the client has clear intent. They are showing ways in which they can actually go through with this. And therefore, there is a plan with means, the gun, the rope. They've already taped the windows in their garage closed. There are there's a stockpile of medications, that they haven't thrown away to save for that day when they plan on taking them all at once. And there is a history. The research shows very clearly that if there's an attempt in the last 2 years, not necessarily ideation, but an actual attempt in the last 2 years, then they're automatically considered critical. And I'll make this a little bit simpler here in just a minute. So some intervention activities are: Q, question, try to assess the level of rest. P, persuade them to get additional support and therapy as necessary. You are coaches. I am a coach. I'm a business coach. I'm an executive coach. I don't have any mental health training other than the extensive, actually, suicide training that I've gotten from many different sources. And I'll show you some of those here at the end of the presentation. Mm-hmm. And refer to a good therapist. And one of your responsibilities, as mentioned here, is to know some of the local numbers that you can call. People that are contemplating suicide often prefer a local person to someone at the national hotline sitting, who knows where on the other side of the nation. So an 800 number, like we just showed up, or a similar alternative, know those, have them written down. I actually have them in my wallet because I'm a known interventionist, and I get calls at all odd hours where people say, "Hey, Michael, there's this guy in my garage. He's got a pistol and he's planning on using it on himself. Would you talk to him?" I always think, closed question. Sure. What are we going to say? No, I'm not going to talk to him. But know who to call. And you can always call me if you want to have, a further talk on what to do in a given situation. And one of the keys to anyone at risk, regardless of the situation, is not to abandon them. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to be with them for the next 72 hours or be on the phone with them, but make sure that they are taken care of, and make sure that your trust relationship is being maintained in those first 72 hours, that you're touching base on them, that you're, following up on the accountability that you set up on how they are going to, get with their therapist and, talk through the situation. And basically what we want to always do is, stay in touch with people. Here is the, again, National Suicide Line. It's 1-800-SUICIDE. And I'm going to give you several different ones. The 1-800-273-TALK tends to be the most used number. But unfortunately, sometimes there's a backlog and it takes more than a couple of minutes for people to get connected. So it's always good to have alternative numbers in case they need to make that faster. Maybe you are going to make the call for them and then, bring them in as a third party connection to the call. But either way, being connected with the right resources is your responsibility as a professional, regardless of whether you're a coach, lawyer, or a plumber. I can well imagine that plumbers could walk into situations where they find people in great need. Okay. In 2022, brace yourself. We're going to get a 3-digit code like 911. It's going to be 988. And in July, across North America, including Canada, of course, this number will be installed. It's actually installed in some places. I've never actually tried it because I don't want to raise an alarm that doesn't exist. But we will have a 911 equivalent. Write that down, 988, so that we can use that. All right, coming to the meat of my presentation. And I only have about 10 more minutes, but this is the part that I really want you to take home, is this immediate decision to deciding between whether it's critical or not critical. And my team and I have come up with an acronym, Please Don't Die: Death, Intent, and Experience. Asking questions about and the experience. So let's go over those in more detail. You asked for good questions and not so good questions. So regarding death, are you thinking about suicide? Notice that is a closed-ended question. We're not necessarily exploring with the client as much as we are trying to get a definitive assessment on what's going on here. So a lot of times these suicide questions tend to be yes or no questions. Have you been contemplating death? What do you mean when you say you wish it were all over? Have you been considering killing yourself? Notice that a not so good question is, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Because people will say, no, I would never hurt myself. I'm just planning on killing myself. I don't really understand the logic there, but they would not use razor blades or a gun or anything like that, but they would, take a, a bottle full of lethal pills and, hope that they don't wake up. And we know this because we talk to people that do wake up and were, well, as we say, unsuccessful. Bad verbiage, but that's what way we say someone was unsuccessful in their attempt. Yay. So we ask questions about death. And then we go to intent. Do you have a plan? How soon? It's I've only heard of this happening to one coach in all of the thousands of people that I've talked to, where a coach straight out of coaching school gets a call from a client that says, I have a gun to my head and how you answer the question is going to determine whether I pull the trigger or not. Scary. That's only happened once in the thousands of people that I've interviewed here. So usually you have a lot more time. Most of the time, I would say, a good 3/4 of the time at least or higher, they're not necessarily thinking about taking their life on your watch during this conversation in the next 24 hours. Yet we always take that seriously. When I was a youth pastor, one of the things that I learned was always take the word suicide seriously. Never joke about it, never brush it off, always take it seriously. I was on my way to the emergency room in my local area to finish my training on suicide intervention, and I had a head-on collision, and I was taken to the emergency room. And they asked me, 13 questions, 3 of which said, have you ever attempted suicide? Are you suicidal now? Do you desire to end your life? And I was so impressed that here I was an interventionist, but I was a patient at that moment. And they went through in all seriousness and asked me those questions because we take this seriously. And if someone is in this second point here, they have, a gun, hanging poison pills, gas, whatever, your antenna go up. So listen for evidence of seriousness. Listen for, I want it to be all over, that underlying concern that it's just not anything I want to continue. Perhaps they're suicidal. And you wouldn't ask this closed question. You're not seriously thinking of hurting yourself, are you? Like, I really don't have the time for a suicide intervention right now. So, please don't be suicidal because, I don't want to help you right now. That is obviously never the position that a professional takes in any industry. And the third one, experience. So as I mentioned here, 2 years is the key number. So you just have to remember 3 things to determine that someone's, critical. They have a death wish, they have the means to do it, and they have some history with this, namely 2 years. Listen for evidence of care, of pastors, prayer groups, rehab centers, friends, relatives that have stepped in, and listen for those deep relationships that they want to continue with. In other words, in the garage example here, who would miss you if you went ahead and pulled that trigger? Well, my nephew. What about your experience with your nephew would be tragic for him? Well, every summer we go fishing for a week, and we don't catch many fish, but it's just he and I on the boat, and it's one of my highlights of the year. And I know from his mom that it's definitely the highlight of his summer. And that relationship, that desire to stay connected with his nephew and how it would affect the nephew was what actually turned him back around. We know from asking people that have attempted, and then also their circle of influence around them, that every attempt affects 18 people profoundly. And if they complete the attempt, it affects 34 people profoundly. And I don't use that statistic right off the bat, but sometimes after I've been talking to people for a while, like an hour or two, sometimes I bring that in there because they need to realize that it's not just about them. Okay, so please don't die, death, intent, experience. Hopefully that will be an easy thing for you to remember, take with you. Other good questions are, who else can you talk about this? If they are religious, what does God think about your situation? What does he want you to do? Have you been in support with a mental health professional? Listen for connections, relatives visiting Christmas. It's a myth that people attempt suicide more during Christmas. Is actually the opposite, because they're going to see people that they've looked forward to seeing for a long time and haven't seen. And so actually suicides drop during the holidays. Getting a job promotion, college diploma, keeping things alive are, their children, their garden, their dog. Really, I had an intervention once. What kept her going, what kept her desiring for the future, was her tomato garden. You know, she had planted the tomatoes and they were just coming up, and she wanted to see how well they flourished, and that was the trigger that kept her alive for that particular intervention. Not a good question is, since you feel no hope, what will give you hope? Um, so we and our team, we've discussed this at length. There's basically two things that are going on here: hope and care. And we prefer care over hope, because most of the people that are suicidal are depressed at that moment. They're either clinically depressed or despondent, you know, temporarily depressed. And what is often causing that depression is that lack of hope. So if you say, what will give you hope, you're actually giving fuel to the fire. So care is a better thing. Who cares for you? You know, who do you care about? If nothing else, I care for you. I had someone say, why do you care? And I said, look, I just drove 45 minutes in a snowstorm to get here. I care about you. You are valuable. Well, why? I said, because you live and you deserve to live, and you can have a great future. And let's see what we can do to make that happen. So coming down the home stretch here, I know that I'm fire hosing you, but I want to get to that discussion round, because that's really where the meat of the presentation, you know, happens when you get your questions answered. So one more thing here, the QPR Institute, as I mentioned, .com, the suicide prevention line, which is sponsored by suicide prevention lifeline.org, the suicide prevention services, and the suicide prevention resource center. You can take free courses. You register, you can take about 7 or 8 free courses from the SPRC, the American Association of Suicidology, is more theoretical. Suicide.org is a great place. Some of your clients are out of the country. I think, you know, it's really hard sometimes to figure out what to refer, who to refer them to. So the International Association for Suicide Prevention also have resources. My organization, suicide coaching suicideawareness.com is not yet launched. We don't have our website up yet, but hopefully it'll be up in a couple of weeks. So if you want to write that down, it's one word, coaching suicideawareness.com. And we will have it's actually very difficult to get local numbers across the world. So coming into the home stretch, again, contacting is a key thing. You can call me and text me, write an email to me. I'd be happy to set an appointment with you. And as I mentioned, also, if you would like to join our army, we refer to ourselves as an army of mighty soldiers trying to create awareness among coaches for suicide. I'd be happy to give you that information. I have about 7 more slides that give lots of statistics that tend to answer specific questions that come after this point, but I'm going to stop sharing right now and turn the microphone over to Carissa and Anik to let me know all of these wonderful questions that I'm seeing in the chat that I haven't taken the time, obviously, to read. So let's have at it. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for that overview and giving us some practical tools that we can use, Dr. Marks. A consistent question, just to kick us off, is when a client does bring up the topic of suicide and their interest or intent there, what are our specific responsibilities in terms of reporting, whether it's to family members or professionals? What does that look like?
Okay. If they're a minor, just like child abuse, in 48 states of the nation have mandatory reporting for abuse of minors. And suicide among a minor, 18 or younger, would definitely fall into that category. So that's an automatic given. You have to tell somebody, at least their parents. Although I was called into an intervention and it's like, have the parents been notified? Yes. I said, well, where are they? Well, they're not here. Okay. Should we call the parents in? Well, we think the parents are the reason why she's attempted to slice her wrists. It's like, okay. So there's a little bit of discretion that needs to be involved there. Now, 18 or over, Virginia, and I think it's New York, have mandatory reporting among professionals. Almost every other state leaves it up to the discretion of the professional. So legally, technically, you're not under any obligation. Morally is a different story. Now, just like CPR, if you crack somebody's ribs while giving them CPR, you're not going to be sued for that. If you help save their life with a suicide intervention, there is little that can happen. There was a case, and I noticed here, should you call the police, a therapist trainee in Florida called the police because he thought there was imminent danger. And the client was so embarrassed with the sheriff showing up with blue lights in front of her house, she tried to sue the clinic. Of course, the case was thrown out, but the therapist and all of the employees were under watch by the APA until that could get cleared, and that took 2 years. So if you're in an area, like I live in the mountains of Colorado, where an intervention isn't really that great, there aren't many mental health professionals that they can go to. Sometimes just calling the sheriff is the best thing. But if the sheriff is not trained, doesn't know what to do, situations occur where all they do is tackle the person, lock them down, in other words, put handcuffs on them and take them to jail and watch them for 72 hours. Is that the best intervention? I don't know, but at least the person's still alive.
Mm-hmm.
Scary. What's next?
A lot of intuition is needed in those situations as far as what's going to best serve the immediate need of the client as well as the long term. But certainly having that short list of professionals in the area is really valuable. A question related to the reporting: what if you are based in Texas, but your client is in Virginia or New York? Does mandatory reporting apply?
Again, for minors, yes. For adults, Virginia is one of those states and one of the two that I know of. So the answer would be obviously yes. What would you do if the client were in Virginia threatening suicide? I don't know. I would call the next, trusted person that I knew in the professional circles of Virginia. And if nothing else, I'd go to one of these other numbers that would allow me to, find someone here. Again, we're talking about critical, high risk versus moderate or low. It's really only when it's critical or high that quick action is appropriate. What is slow action? I keep saying 72 hours because in 72 hours, the desire to end one's life will pretty much abate. That doesn't mean they're done, but it does mean that, the risk factor will normally go from critical to moderate or from high to moderate, or maybe even low. They might have been drunk, that's just really normal in those situations, unfortunately.
How much does the incidence of another family member's suicide impact risk?
That's called the contagion theory, also known as the Werther effect, where, so I'm answering a bigger question that was asked, the copycat effect, where, and it's, been kicked around a lot that teenagers will, take their lives and copy away someone who got a lot of attention, someone who was wanting a lot of attention, gets a lot of media coverage. The teenager will copy that because that's what they want. The fact that they're not there to enjoy their fame, is a little mind-boggling. But so there's this whole thing about the contagion effect, and that's what's at play here in a family. It's not that your genetics are in any way compromised because someone ahead of you committed suicide. In Ireland, it was held that uh, you are genetically inclined towards suicide, and that the laws around that weren't repealed until 1974. So it's a really modern concept that there's no genetic predisposition. It used to be that you would never be an officer in the British Army or military if anyone in your household ever committed suicide because you were genetically disposed. However, when people are exposed to coping mechanisms that they never thought of before, oh, suicide is a coping mechanism. I could do that and it would end my situation. I never thought about it before. So the contagion effect happens when people learn about a way to cope, which was previously foreign to them. Now, getting back to the family member, if you're raised with the fact that Uncle Sally ended her life, all your life, you're familiar with the coping mechanism of ending your life. And it's not a new thought to you. You've been exposed to this for your entire, lifetime. And it becomes easier for you to think in that direction. So I over answered the question on purpose. Okay.
Gives context both historically, but also really empowering people to make their own choices based on their context. There's several questions in terms of just gauging what we're hearing from a person. I mean, one specifically in the context of COVID, we're not having the direct interaction. How do you trust what a client is saying or not saying when they say there's no risk, but you aren't sure you really believe them?
So you take it seriously. You don't joke about it. They can joke about it all day long. And they will, like, oh, I wasn't serious. I was just joking. And, like I said, the emergency room person looks at me and says, have you ever attempted suicide? And I just laughed because, that's why I was there. I was heading towards the emergency room to get my certification. So it was ironic, but she was serious about it. And I respected that. And I thought, good. I'm in a good emergency room. They take this thing seriously. So when you have a gut feeling that there might be ideation, we're not talking about implementation. We're talking about ideation. You stay with that. And as a good coach, you keep remembering things about your client. And you say, Frank, you've said 7 times in the last 4 conversations that life's just not worth living. What does that mean? You're paying attention. This is, powerful listening, if you will, which is what we do as coaches. And, the other thing is, it's very clear that the more you talk about it, the less likely someone will attempt. For example, talking about suicide at the dinner table with your children is a good thing. So someone down the street takes their life. Well, you shouldn't ignore the opportunity. You should bring that to the table because people need to know that it's okay to talk about suicide. It's not okay. Our family does not talk about it. Aunt Sally committed suicide. We don't talk about that. That's going to increase the stigma and not help the person who is thinking about it. They need an out. For example, I was driving cross country with my son and he was going through a divorce. And I said to him, son, people going through a divorce sometimes, contemplate suicide. And I just want you to know that, if your thoughts go dark, you have someone to talk to. And his response was, pardon the expression, Dad, that's bullshit. Okay, fine. But the next morning at breakfast, he said, I was thinking about what you said last night in the car, and I'm not suicidal, but I can see where, in such a life-changing situation, my thoughts could go dark, and I'm glad to have someone I know and I can talk to. And as I said at the beginning, you as a coach might be that trusted person. Hopefully their family and their, inner circle are those trusted people. But as we know, we don't always have clients that have a great circle of trusted friends and family members they can depend on. I had a client tell me a couple of years ago, Michael, you are the only person I can really confide in. And I thought, oh my goodness, dude, you need a marriage counselor. But I was there for him. And we stayed on coaching topics. It wasn't therapy, but he had realized that I was the only person that he could really trust. So again, over answering the question, Carissa, but that's what we instructors do is we take every opportunity to add a little extra to the mix. Mm-hmm.
What you said is so powerful, though, that the more you talk about the suicide,
Mm-hmm.
the less likely
Mm-hmm.
it becomes. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
as just an axiom that we can take away to be exploring it with people, bringing it to the light, taking the stigma away, that really right there frees people up. Someone even asked, what can I do to make them want to talk?
Let's trust. And trust is one of our competencies, right? And I believe that trust is the most important competencies. If you don't have trust, you don't have coaching. And so what can you do to increase the trust? And it's hard to increase trust. It's very easy to violate trust. And as a member of the IRB, the committee that looks at complaints against coaches, I can tell you that at the root of at least the majority, if not 3/4 of complaints, is the coach broke the client's trust in one way or another. And so, it is incumbent on the coach to have a professional relationship and not to be empathetic to the point of the coach being dysfunctional, but at the same point in time being professional enough to know, okay, I need to do something. I need to act. I need to give the client a phone number or find a local source or work with a client. They'll tell you, who can you call right now after we hang up and talk to about this? Well, my sister. Okay. So when we hang up, you're going to call your sister immediately. Well, no, she's at work, so I'll call her at 5:00. I'm going to text you at 6:00 and ask you if you've called your sister. Is that okay? Yes, it is. Accountability, right? 72 hours. Make sure that you're staying in their life as much as possible for those 72 hours. And then really for the next 72 days. It's going to take, like we said, 2 years before they're really mentally over it. Mm-hmm.
That's a wonderful combination of the trusting listening, but also the direct accountability of what are you going to do next to get the support that you need in this situation.
Mm-hmm.
A question was asked, do you speak to groups outside of coaches, whether
Absolutely.
it's education?
Yeah. I'll give this presentation to anybody that'll listen. I've given it to factory floors, marketing organizations, anyone that'll listen, not a problem. We're saving lives. Yes.
So people could reach out to you if they have other audiences that would benefit from.
And I'm serious at this at the beginning. You take the presentation, you take the PowerPoint, and you give the presentation. Have at it. You have my permission. There's no copyright here. Do it. Save lives.
The more we spread the word and have these conversations, more lives are saved. with all of that, how prevalent is suicide actually in coaching across the board?
I don't have a number for that. But it doesn't happen very often. I've heard someone speculate that if you coach for 10 years, you'll have one situation. And I've said that to people, and it's like, oh, really? I've been coaching for, 2 years, and I've already had 7. Like, okay. Mm-hmm.
Statistically speaking, it's small, yet always good to be prepared with with resources. And
Mm-hmm.
2 last resource questions before we wrap up here. In terms of referring, do you tend to refer people to a mental health professional, to
Yes.
a counselor? Are there particular kinds that are better than others?
Right. A mental health professional is always good. Religious figures, pastors, rabbis, group leaders are good, but they might not be mentally health trained here. Someone that's suicidal is not mentally stable, right? I mean, at that moment, they could be the most stable person in the world, but if they're contemplating suicide, they're not mentally stable at that time. And so someone that can professionally deal with that instability, and that might be, a pastor, priest, or rabbi. Many of them are trained in that and can deal with it very well. But, the key is care. And your sister might be the best care. She knows nothing about mental health, but she cares for you, and that's going to keep you alive.
Mm.
And so the best choice is the person who has a lot of trust, who's had a high trust esteem among the person that's contemplating suicide.
The relational connection
Right.
is huge. Once that 72 hours is passed, what's recommended from there in terms of supporting the person?
Well, checking back, Frank, a couple of weeks ago, you were in a dark place. How's it going? Frank, you said you were going to re-engage with your therapist at least once a week. What's with that? Some people will say that if they are mentally unstable, they don't deserve to be a coaching client. I don't, subscribe to that mentality. I think they can be, getting therapy and getting coaching at the same time. I think it's actually a wonderful combination. But both I and the therapist know where our boundaries are. We stay in our lane.
Really, it's keeping the conversation open so that they
Mm-hmm.
have all of the resources
Mm-hmm.
they need. And thank you for your generous sharing of resources today. Out of all the trainings that you mentioned, is there one top one? And we have just a few seconds left, so people
QPR.
can email you as well. But what's the top training?
QPRinstitute.org, $29.95 online, take you 2 hours.
Okay, that we'll be sure to check that one out. So thank you everyone for joining us over your lunch afternoon. Here you'll be getting the information shortly with your CCEUs and documentation, and please do reach out to Dr. Marks if you have additional questions. You'll be giving all of the resources and things so that you have them at your fingertips. And do take the survey as well. We value your input on all of these presentations. And we've got quite a roster planned for the rest of 2021. So keep your calendars bookmarked for the second Thursday of the month for these upcoming topics. And if you have any questions on the series or getting your information and credential, you can always reach out to Anik. Thank you, Anik, just for all of your behind the scenes work to make these such a success. You've really been a backbone of the series, and we're going into our 3rd year here. So it's great that we can connect coaches all across the region with these resources. Back to you, Anik.
Thank you, Carissa, and thank you again, Michael, for this presentation today, and thank you all for coming.
Have a great afternoon.